The royal hall of the Zyori Empire was made of tall crystal towers that caught the light of two suns. The people of the empire were proud, elegant, and sharp in speech. They valued strength, power, and noble birth above all things. So when Queen Myra stood before her council and declared that she had chosen a husband, every noble leaned forward to hear the name. They expected a warrior. They expected a prince from another star, or a leader of fleets. Instead, Myra spoke with calm strength. I have chosen a man from the human colonies. His name is Darren. The hall grew silent. Whispers spread like fire in dry grass. A farmer, someone muttered. A commoner, another scoffed. Surely this is a mistake, said one of the elder lords. But Myra's eyes did not waver. She had seen countless warriors, countless lords. Their pride filled the air like smoke, choking all truth. She wanted something else, someone who did not hunger for power. When she had met Darren on a distant farming world, she saw a man who carried himself with steady calm. He had kind hands, gentle words, and no thirst for crowns. That was why she chose him. When Darren entered the hall for the first time, he wore simple clothes. His hair was plain, his steps unhurried. He bowed awkwardly, not with the sharp grace of the Zyori, but with the sincerity of a man who respected others. The nobles hid their laughter behind their hands. To them he looked weak, soft, and out of place among shining armor and jeweled robes. Myra, however, smiled. From that day forward, Darren lived inside the great palace. Life there was strange for him. He had grown up among fields of grain, waking at dawn, working with soil, tending to animals. Now he walked through endless corridors of crystal, with servants bowing at his steps. But Darren did not change. He asked the servants about their families, learned the names of the guards, and even visited the palace gardens to work with his hands. At first, the court laughed. A royal husband digging in the soil was a joke to them. But when the gardens began to flourish with new fruits and bright flowers, the laughter grew quieter. Myra often watched him from the balcony. She wondered how he stayed so calm among people who judged him at every turn. When her generals challenged his worth, Darren never answered with anger. He simply smiled and said he was glad to serve in his own way. Yet Myra noticed small things that others ignored. When soldiers practiced sword drills in the courtyard, Darren's eyes followed their movements with sharp focus. When the council argued, he sat silent, but his gaze measured each lord with a calm that looked deeper than words. Sometimes at night, Myra saw him stand at the balcony, looking at the stars with a heaviness in his face. He never spoke of it, but she knew he carried a past. Still, to her people, he remained a humble stranger. To her council, he was unworthy. To her, he was a mystery she wished to understand. One evening, during a feast in the great hall, a lord raised his cup and said loudly, "A queen of warriors deserves a husband of warriors. Yet here we drink to a farmer who hides behind her crown." The hall laughed, though Myra's eyes turned cold. She opened her mouth to answer, but Darren placed a hand on hers gently. He rose, not in anger, but with quiet strength. "I was not born among stars of crystal," he said. "I cannot lift a blade as your soldiers do, nor command fleets as your generals can. But I can plant a seed and make it grow. I can mend a broken fence and help a neighbor stand again. If that is weakness, then I carry it proudly." His words were simple, but they silenced the laughter. Myra saw surprise on the faces around her. They expected shame or anger, but Darren gave them neither. He gave them truth. Later that night, Myra walked with him in the quiet of the gardens. The air smelled of blossoms, and the twin moons shone on the leaves. She studied him carefully. "You do not defend yourself with pride," she said. "Why?" Darren smiled faintly. "Because pride is noise. Noise cannot feed the hungry, cannot bring comfort, cannot heal wounds. I left a life where too much pride brought only ruin. I will not live it again." Myra wanted to ask more, but his eyes held a shadow that told her he was not ready to share. She respected that silence. Still, she felt the stir of something new inside her. She had married him believing he was a simple man. But perhaps he was not simple at all. Perhaps his humility was not weakness, but strength of another kind. The days passed, and slowly, the palace began to change. Guards found themselves respecting the human who remembered their names. Servants told stories of a royal husband who thanked them for every meal. Even the lords grew uneasy, for their scorn no longer found easy ground. Myra watched it all with quiet pride. Yet beneath this peace, shadows gathered beyond the empire's borders. Whispers of invasion reached the palace walls. And though Myra did not yet know it, the day would soon come when her humble husband would show the truth of who he really was. The empire of Zyari spread across many stars, its fleets strong, its armies proud. Yet even the strongest empire had enemies watching in silence. In distant regions, old rivals whispered plans. Traders spoke of warships gathering beyond the borders. Still, inside the shining palace, life moved in calm rhythm, and many thought the queen's new marriage was the greatest concern of the people. To the nobles, Darren remained a man of little importance. He was the husband of their queen, but nothing more. They called him the farmer of stars in mocking tones. Yet he never raised his voice against them. Instead, he walked the palace halls with patience, never showing anger. Queen Myra, however, had begun to notice things others ignored. When her council debated matters of war and trade, Darren sat quietly at the side, listening. He never interrupted, never tried to advise. But Myra saw the way his eyes studied the maps, the way his hands sometimes traced invisible lines across the table as though he already knew paths the council had not seen. One evening, Myra invited him to join her in the royal library. The hall was filled with scrolls of history, star charts, and records of battles fought long ago. She wished to understand him better. "Darren," she said softly as they walked among the shelves. "You speak little of your past. You tell me you were a farmer. But when you watch my generals, I see knowledge in your eyes. I see discipline. Tell me truth. Who were you before you came to me?" Darren looked at her with calm eyes. For a moment, silence hung between them. Then he shook his head gently. "I was a man who fought once. That life brought me nothing but loss. So I left it behind. I became a farmer because the land does not lie. A seed grows if you care for it. It does not betray, it does not thirst for glory. That was the life I wanted." Myra studied him carefully. She felt there was more he did not say, but she did not press him further. She respected the walls he had built around his memories. In the days that followed, rumors grew stronger. Scouts reported movements near the border. Strange signals crossed the deep sky. Myra called her council together, and the chamber filled with sharp voices. Generals spoke of strategy, lords argued for caution, and some urged the queen to marry again to form an alliance with a powerful neighbor. Myra held her ground. "I have chosen my path," she said firmly. "Our defense will not come from fear or false alliances, but from courage and wisdom." As the council argued, Darren sat at her side, silent as always. But when the meeting ended, and the lords had left in a storm of voices, Myra turned to him. "You listened," she said. "What did you see?" Darren hesitated. Then at last, he spoke. "Your generals think as warriors of honor. They will meet the enemy in open battle, strength against strength. But enemies who gather in secret do not seek honor. They seek weakness. If they come, they will strike where pride blinds you. That is what I see." Myra felt a chill at his words. "How do you know this?" she asked. Darren lowered his gaze. "Because I once followed men who thought as your generals do. And I watched them fall." That night, as Myra lay awake, she thought of his words. The more she studied him, the more she believed there was a story buried deep inside him, a story written not in soil and crops, but in battles and shadows. The truth began to show itself not long after. One morning, as the palace prepared for a festival, an alarm rang through the corridors. A group of enemy scouts had slipped past the borders and entered the capital itself. No one had expected such boldness. Panic spread through the palace as soldiers rushed to defend the gates. Myra was quickly moved by her guards toward the inner chambers. Darren was with her. He walked calmly, even as shouts echoed through the halls. When the sound of boots grew closer, Myra's guards drew their blades. But before they could strike, shadows leapt from the corridor. Enemy soldiers in black armor surged forward, faster than expected. The guards fought bravely, but the attackers were skilled. Myra felt herself pulled back, her crown slipping as blades clashed around her. For the first time, fear gripped her heart. Then she saw Darren move. He did not hesitate. His body shifted with sudden precision. In one smooth motion, he seized a fallen guard's weapon and spun it with the ease of long practice. Every strike was clean, every motion controlled. Where her guard stumbled, Darren stood unshaken. His calm eyes burned with focus as he cut through the attackers with skill no farmer should have possessed. Myra could hardly breathe as she watched. He was no clumsy commoner now. He was a soldier, trained and seasoned, his movements as sharp as lightning. Within moments, the enemy scouts lay defeated at his feet, and the corridor grew silent again. Her guards looked at him in shock. None of them had expected such strength, such skill, from the man they mocked as weak. Darren dropped the weapon and turned to Myra. His face was calm, though his eyes carried a shadow of pain. "Are you hurt?" he asked simply. Myra shook her head, unable to speak. Later, when they were safe within the inner chamber, she faced him. "You told me you were only a farmer," she whispered. "But what I saw was not the work of a farmer's hands." "Who are you, Darren?" For a long time, he was silent. At last, he answered. "I was once a commander in the Human Defense Force. I led men into battles across the stars. I made choices that saved some, but cost many. When I lost those under my command, I left. I could not carry the weight any longer. So I sought peace in the soil, far from war. That is the truth you wish to know." Myra's heart trembled. She saw now why his eyes had always held such depth, why he spoke with such calm. He was not simple. He was a man shaped by loss, a warrior who had walked away from glory, carrying silence as his shield. And yet, despite his past, he had saved her without hesitation. As she looked at him, she realized the whispers of the court meant nothing. She had not married weakness. She had married strength hidden beneath humility. What she did not yet know was that the empire itself would soon need that hidden strength. For the enemy who sent scouts into her palace was only testing the waters. The storm of war was coming. The capital city of the Zyari Empire was alive with music and banners when the festival began. Traders filled the streets, children carried bright flags, and musicians played songs that echoed through the wide squares. It was a celebration meant to show strength and peace at the same time. Yet beneath the shining colors, unease grew in quiet corners. Rumors of war had spread, and even as people danced, many kept their eyes on the skies. Inside the palace, Queen Myra stood tall, dressed in silver robes that shimmered under the twin suns. Her husband, Darren, walked beside her. He looked plain in simple clothes, but there was something in his steady presence that calmed her. Only a few days earlier, she had seen him fight like no farmer ever could. The memory of his precise movements still lingered in her mind. She had asked for truth, and he had given it. He was no ordinary man. He was once a commander, a leader of human soldiers. Still, he chose silence after that night. He did not boast, did not try to take command of her generals. Instead, he returned to his quiet ways, walking the gardens, speaking kindly to guards, watching without drawing attention. Yet Myra knew a storm was near. She had seen it in his eyes when he admitted who he once was. That storm arrived sooner than expected. As the festival reached its height, the skies above the city grew dark. At first, people thought clouds had gathered. But when the shadows moved in sharp formation, fear rippled through the crowd. Enemy ships cut across the light of the suns, their black hulls glinting like blades. Alarms rang through the city. The festival music broke into screams. Myra's guards rushed her toward the safety of the palace walls. Citizens scattered as soldiers moved to defend the gates. The first blasts from the enemy ships shook the air, scattering banners and breaking towers. The capital, heart of the empire, was under attack. Inside the command hall, generals gathered around the great star map. They shouted orders, calling fleets to rise and ground cannons to fire. Pride filled their voices, but Myra remembered Darren's warning. Enemies who move in secret do not seek honor. They seek weakness. Darren stood near the edge of the hall, silent as always. But Myra could see his eyes move across the star map, studying every shift of enemy lines, every delay of the Empire's response. He spoke no word, and still Myra felt the weight of his thoughts. The first enemy strike came against the eastern gates. Explosions shattered crystal towers, and soldiers rushed to hold the line. Myra prepared to join her forces on the wall, but before she could move, another alarm sounded. A smaller enemy unit had landed near the palace itself, using the chaos as cover. Myra's blood chilled. The capital was not just under attack. She herself was the target. Guards moved quickly, surrounding her, but the enemy was already inside the outer courtyard. Blades clashed, voices shouted, and smoke filled the air. Darren stepped forward, his calm breaking into firm command. "Move her to the inner gate," he said, his voice steady. The guards hesitated, unaccustomed to taking orders from him. But there was no time for pride. The enemy pressed harder with every moment. Myra saw him pick up a fallen soldier's staff. In his hands, the weapon looked alive. His steps were sure, his strikes sharp. Where guards faltered, he covered them. Where lines broke, he held them together. "Who trained him?" one guard whispered in shock as they fought side by side. "No one here," another muttered. "Not in our empire." Myra's heart pounded as she watched. Darren moved with the discipline of a man who had lived this life before. Each motion was measured, each choice exact. He was not fighting for glory. He was fighting for her, for the people, for survival. The battle pushed into the palace halls. Myra was hurried along marble steps as explosions echoed behind her. Darren never left her side. When a group of enemy soldiers cut off their path, he stepped forward without hesitation. He fought with calm focus, using both skill and awareness. He knew when to strike, when to fall back, when to use the environment itself as his shield. By the time they reached the inner chamber, Myra's guards looked at him not as a burden but as a leader. They followed his signals without question. It was as if they had forgotten their doubts. In the heat of battle, respect was no longer optional. It was earned. At last, the palace cannons struck back with full force, and allied ships arrived to chase the attackers. The enemy withdrew, leaving smoke and ruin behind. The capital was shaken, but not destroyed. Myra stood among her people, her robes torn, her crown lost in the chaos. Darren stood beside her, his hands still steady, though his eyes carried the weight of battles long past. When the danger was over, the generals bowed before the queen, swearing they would strengthen the defenses, swearing the enemy would never reach so close again. But Myra's gaze was on Darren. In front of the council, she spoke. This man you mocked as a farmer has stood as a shield where others faltered. He has shown more courage than the voices that filled this hall with pride. Remember his strength, for it has saved your queen. The generals lowered their heads, some in shame, some in silent respect. That night, when the palace grew quiet again, Myra walked with Darren through the ruined courtyard. Crystals lay broken, smoke drifted through the air, and guards worked to clear the wreckage. She turned to him, her eyes sharp with both gratitude and curiosity. You once told me you left your old life behind, she said. But today I saw you step into it again without pause. Why? Darren looked at the stars above. His voice was soft, but steady. Because peace is worth nothing if you cannot protect it? I left the life of war because I wanted peace. But if war comes to the gates of the ones I love, then I cannot turn away. Myra felt a weight in her chest at his words. She realized now that his humility was not weakness, but choice. He had walked away from power not because he lacked strength, but because he had the courage to seek a different path. Still, she knew the enemy would return. The attack today was not their full force. It was only a test. And when they came again, the empire would need more than generals bound by pride. They would need the man who once commanded human fleets, the man who had fought and lost and still stood strong. The queen looked at her husband, the humble man she had chosen against the will of her council. And for the first time, she understood that her choice might be the very reason her empire still had hope. The palace was quiet after the battle, but the quiet was heavy. Broken towers still stood in smoke, and the people of the city worked to repair what was lost. The attack had shaken the capital, and every soul in the empire now understood that the enemy was not far away. They had reached the heart once, and they could reach it again. In the command hall, Myra sat with her generals. They placed star charts on the table, each one marked with enemy movements. Voices rose, sharp with anger and pride. Some called for revenge, others demanded stronger walls, but no one agreed on a single plan. Myra listened, but her eyes moved often toward Darren, who stood near the edge of the chamber. He said nothing. He only studied the maps with calm eyes, as though every detail already told him a story no one else could read. When the meeting ended without decision, Myra rose from her throne. Leave us, she said firmly. The generals bowed and left, their arguments still echoing in the hall. Darren turned to follow them out, but Myra stopped him. "Stay." He paused, then nodded. For a long moment, Myra said nothing. She walked to the great map and touched the glowing lines with her hand. "You watch in silence, yet I see in your eyes that you know more than they do. Tell me truth, Darren. What do you see here?" He hesitated. "It is not my place to command your fleets." "I am not asking you to command," Myra replied. "I am asking you to speak. You are my husband, and I trust you. More than that, I saw you fight, I saw you lead. I will not allow silence to hide the truth. Speak to me." Darren looked at her, and for the first time since their marriage, she saw the shadow in his eyes grow deeper. He stepped closer to the map and placed his hand over the glowing stars. "They are not striking to win yet," he said quietly. "This was a probe. They wanted to see your response, to measure your strength, to test your discipline. The real war has not begun. It will come soon." Myra felt her breath catch. "How do you know?" Darren's voice was low. "Because I have done the same. When I was a commander in the Human Defense Force, I sent scouts to test enemy borders. I watched how quickly they responded, how their leaders moved, where their pride blinded them. That is what your enemy is doing now. And I fear they have already learned more than we wish to admit." Myra stepped back, her eyes searching his face. "You never told me the full truth. You said you commanded men, that you left after loss. But now I must know. Who were you, Darren?" He stood in silence, as if weighing the pain of memories against the need for truth. At last, he spoke. "I was not just a commander. I was the leader of the 3rd Human Fleet. We fought in the border wars against the Kirin raiders. I carried thousands under my command. For years, we won battle after battle, until pride blinded us. I believed we were untouchable. Then one day, the enemy tricked us. They split our forces, drew us into traps. I made choices that cost lives. Entire colonies fell because of my failure. I lost more than half my fleet. Those who survived never looked at me the same way again. I carried their ghosts with me. I could not lead after that. So I left. I laid down the rank, the weapons, the fleets. I chose to farm, to bury myself in soil where no one would follow me." His voice grew quiet, but firm. "That is the truth of who I was. Not just a soldier, but a commander who failed." Myra's heart ached as she listened. She saw the weight he carried, a weight so heavy it had followed him across the stars. She understood now why he had chosen silence, why he had chosen humility. He was not afraid of battle. He was afraid of leading others to death again. Yet she also saw something else. The calm discipline, the sharp eyes, the precise movement in every fight. This was not weakness. This was strength tempered by loss. She stepped closer and placed her hand on his. "You say you failed, but I do not see failure. I see a man who has learned what pride costs. I see a man who values life more than glory. My generals have strength, but they do not have that. You do." Darren looked at her, silent, but she could see conflict in his eyes. That night, Myra called a small council with only her closest advisors. Darren sat beside her, not as a commander, but as her partner. When the advisors spoke of walls, ships, and weapons, Myra turned to Darren. "Tell them what you see." At first, he shook his head. But Myra's gaze was steady, urging him forward. At last, he stood and pointed at the map. "Your fleets are spread too wide," he said. "They defend many borders, but in truth, they defend none. The enemy will not strike where you are strong. They will strike where you believe yourself safe. Your pride is your weakness. If you do not gather your strength, you will lose." The advisors exchanged uneasy glances. Some frowned, unwilling to accept advice from a human farmer. But Myra's voice cut through their doubt. "You have seen his strength with your own eyes. You have seen how he stood when others fell. If you will not listen to me as queen, then listen to him as a soldier who has walked this path before." Slowly, the advisors lowered their heads. They could not deny what they had seen. As the council ended, Myra walked with Darren through the garden once more. The night air was cool, and the stars stretched endless above them. "You fear leading again," she said softly. "But this empire needs you. I need you. Not as a symbol, not as a husband only, but as the man who once carried fleets across the stars." Darren's hands tightened at his sides. "And if I fail again?" Myra turned to him, her eyes steady. "Then you fail beside me. But I will not face this war with prideful generals alone. I would rather face it with a man who knows what loss truly means." For a long time, Darren said nothing. But in his silence, Myra saw his walls begin to crack. She knew the moment was near when he would step out from behind his humility, not because he wanted to, but because he could no longer refuse. The days after the attack brought no peace. Across the empire, reports arrived of enemy movements along the borders. Trade routes were disrupted, colonies went silent, and distant outposts called for help before their signals faded. The Zyori Empire had always stood tall, but now its people felt a shadow hanging over them. Inside the palace, Queen Myra met with her council again. The generals argued louder than before. Some demanded a massive fleet strike to crush the enemy, while others pushed for tighter defenses around the capital. Their voices clashed until the air itself seemed to shake. Myra listened, but her thoughts were not with their pride. Her mind turned again and again to Darren, who sat quietly behind her, eyes steady on the star map. She remembered his words, "Pride is weakness." She remembered the way he fought, the way he led guards during the attack. She knew he carried knowledge the Empire needed. When the generals paused, Myra's voice rose firm and clear. "Enough. Your words circle like hawks but bring no prey. Darren will speak." The chamber grew still. Some lords frowned, others looked away. To them, he was still an outsider, a farmer who had no right to command their fleets. But Myra's gaze was unshaken. Darren stood slowly. He did not raise his voice, yet the hall seemed to grow quiet as he placed his hand on the glowing star map. "Your fleets are stretched thin," he said. "You guard every border, but none with true strength. You chase shadows while the enemy gathers in silence. If you continue, they will break you piece by piece." A general scowled. "You speak as though you know their mind." "I do," Darren answered calmly. "Because I have been where they are. I have sent scouts to test borders, I have waited for the moment when pride left an enemy open. That is what they are doing now. They will not strike where you are ready. They will strike where you believe yourself safe." His words fell like heavy stones. Some generals shifted uncomfortably, remembering the sudden attack on the palace. One young officer, braver than the rest, spoke up. "Then where should we stand?" Darren moved his hand across the map. He pointed at the central system where trade routes crossed. "Here. Gather your fleets not at the edges, but at the heart. Let the enemy believe your borders weak. When they strike, you will be ready. The hall broke into murmurs. Some argued, some doubted. But Myra's voice cut through them. You have seen his strength with your own eyes. You have seen how his words match the truth of our enemy. We will follow this plan. The generals bowed, though some did so with clenched jaws. Yet as they left the hall, Myra noticed a change in their eyes. Where once they saw Darren as a burden, now they saw him as something more. In the days that followed, preparations began. Fleets moved quietly, gathering near the central system. Darren spent long hours with officers, studying maps, training soldiers in new tactics. At first, many resisted, unwilling to follow a human who had once been mocked as a farmer. But when they saw the clarity of his strategies, their doubt began to fade. He taught them not only how to fight but how to think. Do not chase every enemy ship you see, he said. Ask why they want you to chase. Ask what trap waits beyond the next star. Do not fight the battle they offer. Fight the battle you choose. Soldiers listened. They practiced his drills, followed his orders in exercises, and soon whispered among themselves. The queen's husband is no farmer. He is a commander. Myra often watched from the edge of the training fields. She saw the way he moved among soldiers, not above them but with them. He spoke to them as equals, shared their meals, remembered their names. In return, they gave him loyalty, not out of fear, but out of respect. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the palace, Myra found him in the garden, hands resting on the rail as he looked toward the horizon. You are changing them, she said softly. Darren shook his head. They change themselves. I only remind them of truths they already know. But you do more, Myra pressed. You give them hope. That is something my generals cannot do. He turned to her, eyes heavy but calm. Hope is dangerous if it is false. I will not promise them victory. I will promise them preparation. If we are ready, then perhaps hope will follow. Myra stepped closer. You still carry doubt. I carry memory, Darren answered. I remember what happens when men follow me and do not return. I remember the weight of every name I lost. That doubt will never leave me. She touched his arm gently. Then let it stay. Doubt will keep you honest. And honesty is what this empire needs more than pride. Before Darren could answer, a messenger hurried into the garden, bowing quickly. Your Majesty. A fleet of enemy ships has entered the outer colonies. They are burning settlements as they advance. Myra's eyes hardened. Summon the council. We will act. When the council gathered, panic filled the chamber. Reports spoke of colonies destroyed, families fleeing, cities burning. The generals shouted for immediate strikes, but Darren studied the map in silence. At last, he spoke. This is not their true force. It is meant to draw you out, to make you scatter your fleets. If you chase them now, you will leave the heart unguarded. That is when they will strike. His words silenced the hall. Myra looked at her generals. You hear him. We will not scatter. We hold the central system as planned. It was a hard choice. To resist the urge to protect every world, to watch colonies suffer while holding strength at the heart, was painful. Yet Myra trusted him. And slowly, the generals began to trust him too. Days later, reports came that confirmed his warning. While the Empire's fleets held steady at the central system, the enemy attempted to strike from another direction, expecting the defenses to be weak. Instead, they found Zyari ships waiting, strong and ready. The trap failed. Soldiers cheered. Officers whispered again of the human husband who saw what others could not. Respect grew stronger. Doubt grew weaker. But Myra knew the storm was far from over. The enemy had tested them twice. The real battle was still to come. That night, as the city lights glowed below the palace, she stood beside Darren. "They follow you now," she said. "Even the ones who doubted. But will you lead them when the true war begins?" Darren was silent for a long time. Then he said softly, "I will stand where I must. Not for glory. Not for crowns. For you. For them. For peace." Myra felt strength in his words. She knew the storm ahead would be fierce, but with him beside her, the Empire still had hope. The storm that had been building finally broke. For weeks the Empire had held steady, waiting for the enemy to show their true hand. Now it came. Scouts rushed back with terrified reports. A vast enemy fleet had crossed into the central systems. It was larger than any seen before, a tide of ships that darkened the stars. Inside the palace war chamber, the map glowed with red as markers for enemy vessels filled the display. Generals paled as they counted the numbers. Some whispered that the Empire could not withstand such power. Others muttered that it would have been better to strike earlier, to scatter their strength while there was still time. Queen Myra stood tall, her eyes steady, though her heart carried weight. She turned to Darren, who studied the map with calm intensity. "This is the strike you warned of," Myra said. Darren nodded. "Yes. They waited for us to commit, and now they throw everything forward. This is the battle that decides all." The generals looked at him. Some still bore doubt, but many had learned respect for his judgment. At last, one of them asked the question on all their minds. "Can we win?" Darren did not answer quickly. His silence stretched across the room, and every ear strained for his words. Finally, he said, "We can, but only if we fight as one. If you break into pieces, you will fall. If you cling to pride, you will fall. If you obey only the truth of the battle, you will stand." Myra gave a firm nod. "Then we stand." Orders were given. Fleets rose from their stations, joining in formation around the central system. Thousands of ships aligned, their engines burning bright in the dark. Soldiers filled their stations, pilots prepared their craft, and the Empire held its breath as the enemy tide approached. The first clash came at the edge of the system. Enemy squadrons swept forward in waves, striking at the defenders. The sky lit with fire as ships clashed, metal breaking, shields flaring. The Empire's fleets fought hard, but the enemy pressed with endless force. From the command ship, Myra and Darren watched the battle unfold. Generals called out reports, officers relayed messages, and the great star map shifted with every movement. Darren stood beside the Queen, giving calm instructions. "Hold the left wing steady. Pull back the right just enough to let them overextend. Do not meet their push head-on. Let them think they are winning ground." The generals obeyed, though some frowned at the thought of retreat. But soon the enemy pressed too far, their formation breaking. At Darren's command, hidden fleets surged forward from behind the central moons, striking the exposed flank. The enemy line staggered, caught by surprise. Cheers rose through the command deck. For the first time in the battle, the Empire pushed back. But victory was not yet certain. The enemy commander, clever and ruthless, unleashed a second wave even larger than the first. New ships poured into the fight, and once again the defenders began to falter. Explosions rocked the void. Whole squadrons vanished in fire. The enemy drove closer and closer to the heart of the system. Panic threatened to take hold. Myra looked at Darren. "We are losing ground again." Darren's face was set, but his eyes burned with focus. "Not yet. They believe strength alone will win. We must show them otherwise." He gave rapid orders. "Split the Central Fleet into 3 groups. Send the first to strike high, the second to strike low, and keep the third hidden in the shadow of the planet. Let the enemy chase the first 2. When they do, the third will cut through their center." The room stirred with nervous energy. It was a dangerous plan, risking the Empire's strongest ships. But Myra trusted him. She gave the command, and the fleets moved. As predicted, the enemy followed the first 2 groups, stretching their lines in the chase. At that moment, the hidden fleet surged forward, striking at the center of the vast enemy formation. Explosions lit the darkness as the enemy's core was torn open. The Empire's soldiers roared in triumph. The tide had turned again. But the enemy refused to break. Ship after ship pressed forward, willing to burn even as their formation shattered. The battle raged on for hours, each side bleeding strength. On the command ship, Myra stood close to Darren, watching as he guided every move. She saw how he bore the weight of each choice, each life, each risk. Yet he never wavered. His voice remained steady, his orders clear. At last, the enemy commander revealed his final gamble. A massive warship, larger than any in the field, advanced through the chaos. Its weapons burned brighter than suns, tearing apart anything in its path. Soldiers who had fought bravely now felt fear as the giant vessel moved closer to the heart of the system. Myra's generals shouted for retreat. Some begged to scatter before the beast. But Darren raised his hand. "No. This is their heart. Break it, and the rest will fall." He called for all fleets to converge. Dozens of ships moved into position, forming a spearhead formation. Darren gave the final order. "Strike as one." The Empire's fleet surged forward, every ship firing at once. The sky became fire, energy pouring into the giant warship. Its shields blazed, its hull shook, but still it pressed on. Closer and closer it came, weapons tearing holes through the Empire's lines. Ships were lost, names vanished from the map. But the fleets held their ground. Darren's voice rang through the command channel. "Hold steady. Do not break." At last, the giant ship's defenses cracked. Explosions burst across its surface. A final barrage struck deep, and with a roar that shook the void, the vessel tore apart in flame. Silence fell. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then the enemy fleet faltered. Leaderless, broken, their courage shattered, they turned and fled into the darkness. The Empire had stood. The last battle was won. Inside the command ship, cheers and cries of relief filled the air. Generals who once doubted Darren bowed their heads with respect. Soldiers spoke his name with pride. Myra looked at him, her heart full. He stood quiet among the noise, his face shadowed with memory, but his eyes steady. She reached for his hand and held it. "You led them to victory," she said. He shook his head gently. "They led themselves. I only showed them the path." But Myra knew the truth. Without him, the Empire would have fallen. Without him, hope would have died. As the stars cleared of fire and the wreckage drifted into silence, she whispered softly, "You were never just a humble man. You were always more." The battle was over, but the memory of it lingered in every corner of the empire. Wreckage floated like scars across the stars, silent reminders of how close the Zyori people had come to losing everything. 4 days after, survivors searched for lost ships, and families waited in fear and hope for news of loved ones. In the capital city, bells rang to honor the fallen. Priests offered prayers for those who did not return. Soldiers marched through the streets, tired but proud, cheered by crowds who once doubted their strength. Everywhere people spoke of victory, but one name rose again and again among the whispers: Darren. Inside the palace, the mood was quiet. Myra sat with her council, but the generals no longer shouted as they once had. Their voices were lower, their words more careful. When they spoke of strategy, they turned their eyes to Darren with respect. When they debated choices, they waited for his thoughts before they spoke their own. Myra watched this change with silent satisfaction. She remembered how they once mocked him, how they dismissed him as a simple man. Now those same leaders leaned on his wisdom. It was proof of what she had known deep inside: humility could hide strength, and true power did not always wear a crown. Darren himself seemed unchanged. He walked the palace halls as quietly as before, greeting servants by name, helping soldiers lift heavy supplies, tending once more to the small garden he had planted. To him, victory did not make him more. To him, he was still a man who wanted peace. But Myra knew better. She found him one evening in the garden, kneeling in the dirt as he pulled weeds from the soil. The stars shone above, and the city lights glittered below. He looked like a farmer again, but her heart saw the commander who had turned the tide of war. "You hide from their praise," she said softly. Darren glanced up, his hands dusty from the soil. "Praise is for the dead more than the living. I do not need it." "But they do," Myra replied. "The people need to honor the one who gave them hope. If you turn away, they will think you are ashamed of what you did." His face grew shadowed, and for a moment she thought he would argue. Then he sighed. "I am not ashamed. But I carry the names of those I lost long before I came here. To accept glory feels like forgetting them." Myra knelt beside him. "You do not honor the fallen by hiding. You honor them by showing that their sacrifice was not wasted. You gave this empire a future. Do not deny them the chance to thank you." For a while he was silent, the sound of night winds moving through the garden leaves. Then at last he nodded. The next day, Myra called for a gathering in the grand hall of the capital. Citizens from across the empire filled the chamber. Soldiers stood in rows, their armor polished, their banners lifted high. Nobles and priests filled the balconies. It was a day of remembrance, but also of unity. Myra stood at the front, her crown shining in the light of torches. Her voice rang clear as she spoke of the war, the bravery of her people, the pain of loss, and the triumph of courage. She honored the fallen by name, and the hall echoed with sorrow and pride. Then she turned, her hand reaching for Darren. "There is one more who must be honored," she declared. When the empire doubted, he saw the truth. When fear rose, he stood firm. When pride would have led us to ruin, he offered wisdom. When the enemy came, he fought not for crowns, not for glory, but for life itself. Her voice grew stronger, filling every corner of the hall. "This man is my husband. He came to us as a stranger, a humble man. Many of you mocked him, many of you doubted him. But now you see who he is. He is the shield that stood between us and destruction. He is the heart that gave us strength. His name is Darren, and he belongs not only to me, but to this empire." The hall shook with sound. Soldiers raised their weapons high, nobles bowed their heads, citizens shouted his name. Darren! 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 Darren stood beside Myra, quiet as always, his face steady but his eyes holding emotion. He did not raise his hands, he did not bow, he simply stood and let the people see him as he was. For the first time, he did not turn away from their voices. After the ceremony, when the crowds had gone and the hall lay silent, Myra walked with him through the palace corridors. "Do you see now?" she asked. "They no longer see you as an outsider. You are one of us." Darren shook his head gently. "I will always be human. I will always be a part." Myra smiled. "You are human, yes. But you are also mine. And because of that, you are part of the empire. That will never change." For the first time since she had met him, he allowed himself a small laugh. "You speak like a queen." "I am a queen," she teased. Then her tone softened. "But I am also your wife. And I am proud of the man I chose." The days turned into weeks, and slowly the empire healed. Fleets were rebuilt, colonies restored, families reunited. The scars of war would remain, but so would the strength gained from victory. In the palace garden, life returned as well. Flowers bloomed, the soil grew rich, and Darren's hands once more nurtured the earth. Children of the court often came to him, asking for stories of the battle. He never spoke of his own deeds. Instead, he told them of the courage of soldiers, of the unity of fleets, of the queen who never lost faith. Myra sometimes stood nearby, listening with quiet pride. She knew he would never seek the spotlight, never claim the title of hero. But to her people, and to history, he would always be remembered as more than a humble man. And in the silence of the garden, as the stars looked down on the empire they had saved, Myra whispered what was in her heart. "I thought I married a quiet farmer. I see now I married the strongest man I will ever know." Darren looked up from the soil, his eyes soft. "And I see I married the only queen who would ever believe in me." They stood together, husband and wife, queen and farmer, human and alien, yet more united than any crown or fleet could bind. Their story had begun in doubt, faced fire in war, and ended in strength.